welcoming you to what is the conclusion of our 4th year of the Pilgrim Forum series. My name is Julie Massey. I'm Associate Vice President for Mission and Student Affairs here, and along with our President, Brian Brees, along with our Vice President for Mission and Student Affairs, Father Jay Foster, and other members of the Cabinet, we're so happy to welcome you here. This indeed still promises to be a terrific morning together. And as many of you know, this series would not exist without the vision and support of Dr. Dan Ritter. Dan has had some health complications this spring, and he continues to recuperate in Florida. And so we hold him in our prayers, and I invite you to do the same and look forward to the next time he can be with us in person. He is most definitely always with us in spirit. This morning we have Dan's daughter, Catherine Godfrey, class of 90, along with our own President Brees and his wife, Carol. So Catherine and Brian representing the class of 90, and we're so glad that you're here. And thanks for traveling to be with us today, Catherine. Before we continue, let's take a moment together in prayer. Today's psalm tells us, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims God's handiwork." As we gather this day, we give thanks to God for the long-awaited signs of spring, the beauty of nature proclaiming God's handiwork. May our hearts be open to the ways in which God seeks to make our lives new, that the human family will more firmly reflect God's vision for fullness of life. We make this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. I do want to share with you, just briefly, a little conversation that the Pilgrim Forum Steering Committee had the last time we met. And that steering committee includes Dan Ritter, it includes his daughter, Catherine, President Brees, Father Jay. And when we met a few months ago, we decided it would really be helpful at this point, 4 years into the series, to be explicit about some of our aims with the Pilgrim Forum. And so I want to make clear that we see the Pilgrim Forum as a place to share information and spur thought. We hope both of those will happen today. We ask our speakers to break open the creed in thought-provoking and accessible ways. And ultimately, we aim to help all of us in attendance to understand more deeply what we believe. To help ensure we are meeting those aims, we want to call 3 things to your attention. I failed to bring up one of my visual aids, but anyway, there is a response card in your materials. Yes, thank you. Yes, there we go. And so, any of you who were with us last time might remember that we said, hey, we updated the card to give you space to make comments, but the space was 1 line last time. So we updated again. We think we're a little more set now. And so we really do invite your comments and reactions, including questions you hope the forum might look into or topics we might explore. We really do welcome that on this sheet, and you can just jot down comments and leave that at the table, and we'll pick it up at the end. If you do not already receive mailings about the Pilgrim Forum, there's a place to indicate your mailing information on the back. But again, we want to commend to you the opportunity to give us your feedback, and that's on the front of this card. Secondly, we want to make sure that you're aware of a couple of things on the Pilgrim Forum website. One thing we want to make sure you know about is the lecture archives page. So some of you have perhaps been at every single Pilgrim Forum, and wonderful. But we should have a punch card for that, right? But if you haven't, and you might think, oh, I came into this series partway through, I wonder what the other presentations were. We want you to be aware that they are all posted on our website, and you're welcome to view them at any time. And we want to show you this box. Tell us what you think. There on the left. And so there is a way to access a survey in which you can tell us, oh, I had a chance to view some of the videos, or I was there in person and I want to pass along some more feedback. And there's a way for you to do that. And that, again, will help us know, are we providing what you're looking for? Is there something else that we can do as we continue to plan and move forward? So all of those points of engagement are really welcomed of you. The Pilgrim Forum website, I think, is on the front of the program. It's just snc.edu, one of those slashes, Pilgrim Forum. And we really do welcome hearing from you. Okay. Now, Father Andrew's going to tell me, hurry up and get started. So, right?
Right,
I know. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to jump into our time together, and we're going to start that today in conversation. And so we've done, a couple of our other presenters have done this, including I think maybe Father Andrew. And so we're going to ask you at your tables to share your reflections for a few moments as we get rolling. And so first off, we'd invite you to have a few minutes of conversation at your tables about these questions. What have been your own lived experiences of resurrection? Or perhaps another way to say that, in what ways has new life or coming back to life been part of your lived experience? So we invite you again at your tables to just share some of your own life experience around those questions. Okay?
But it was true, because I think you were
part of you that has died and is better for the experience because you realized some mistake you dealt with.
I hope you had some rich sharing there. We had some beautiful examples from job change or retirement to childbirth to farming to resurrecting those loved ones who have passed on by telling their stories to the next generation. Just some great examples. Good job, table. We did well. Okay. So now I would like us to turn back to our tables, because this really is going to be our chance to equip our panelists who are coming up shortly and getting more nervous every minute, but to talk about, okay, now bringing this into the focus of today, what are questions that we might have about these lines from the Apostles' Creed? On the third day he rose again from the dead, right? That's where in the Creed we talk explicitly about the resurrection. So what are questions that you might have? And I would suggest, I think I have another, I would suggest, oh, that's not it yet. So just to know that this is coming, I'm going to invite you to, there is a sheet on your table that says our questions, and I'm going to invite you to, sort of send up 2 or 3 questions. We'll collect those from you, so just hold on to them for the moment. But again, at your table, have a little conversation about that question. And then if somebody who has reasonable handwriting can jot down 2 or 3 questions, we'll try to see what we can get the panel to react to. Okay? Does that make enough sense? Yes. Thank you.
going on and on and on. Something that was just very surface, but 3 days or
You can't separate them. You have to join them and keep them together. It's a life.
And my colleague Martha Kodrowski and I will walk around. If you jotted down a few questions, we'll be happy to pick up that sheet. And we're going to try to find maybe to start with some of the most common themes and see if we can make sure that the panel has time to talk through those points and organize it a bit. So Martha's walking around and she'll be happy to get that sheet from you. While she does that, I want to offer just the briefest of introductions to our 3 panelists who I think are familiar faces to many, if not most of us in the room. 2 of these panelists knew we were crafting this backup plan last night while Father Senior was still on the runway. And one, Dr. Kathleen Gallagher Elkins, learned about this opportunity about an hour and a half ago. And if that's not the spirit of communio, I don't know what is. So truly it is, we are actually very fortunate, all of us in this room, fortunate to be able to hear from these 3 wonderful colleagues. So just in the order of next to me to further out, we have Dr. Paul Waddell, professor of theology and religious studies here at St. Norbert. Paul's area of specialization is ethics. He writes beautifully on friendship, and we're just really thrilled to have him here with us today. Next to him is Dr. Kathleen Gallagher Elkins, an assistant professor of theology and religious studies. And Kathleen, her scholarship focuses on scripture and women in the Bible. And she agreed to this very recently, and we're so grateful that we have a scripture scholar amongst those sharing thoughts with us this morning. And then the Reverend Dr. Andrew Safferny is with us. He was our presenter in the fall, if you had the great opportunity to be with us. At that point, we were descending into hell. He's now helping us. I don't mean that personally, Andrew. I just mean that was the topic. Father Andrew Ciferni has been both an adjunct instructor in theology and religious studies, teaching some beloved courses to our students these last 5 years, as well as serving as our director for the Center of Norbertine Studies. He's in his final weeks serving in that position as he's soon to return to his home abbey in Dalesford, and we are grateful and indebted for all the gifts he's shared and really excited that he's able to help us out this morning as well. So while Martha and I continue to look over your questions and try to bring some initial questions to the fore, I'm going to ask these three panelists to share some introductory thoughts that they think can help us frame our discussion of resurrection. And they'll decide what order they're going to go in.
Well, good morning, everybody. I told I have class at 8:20, and I told my class on Tuesday we would start 10 minutes later. If I had known this, I would tell them show up at 8 o'clock. No, but it's great to be here this morning with all of you. I think for myself, Easter fundamentally means for me that in God we meet a love that is stronger than death, and I find that to be just powerfully hopeful. If you think that there's so many things in life that can give us the opposite impression, that sometimes death seems to be winning. It seems to be stronger than life. Sometimes evil seems to be stronger than goodness. So for me, the resurrection of Jesus means that in God we don't encounter a love that tries its best but fails. We don't encounter a love that tries its best but falls short, but rather the resurrection of Jesus says that God not only brought things to life at creation, but God, through the resurrection, continues to bring things to life again and again. So if that's the case, if that means God brings things to life through love again and again, then for me, the heart of Easter is that nothing in life is without hope. I think Easter empowers us to live in hope, and that's an absolutely crucial virtue for not just for Christians, but for anybody.
Thank you for being here. I always really love coming to the Pilgrim Forum, so I was excited to come this morning. I didn't expect to quite be on this side of it, but it's good to see you all here. In terms of my initial framing of this topic, it occurred to me that springtime, of course, springtime is when we celebrate Easter, but springtime is a good season to be thinking about resurrection. I'm married to a gardener. Some of you know my spouse, and you know he really can't be kept busy enough. So having a garden is a good way of keeping him occupied. But he, part of his thing at this time of the year is to go out and look at everything, right? Sort of check on how are the seeds doing, are the bulbs coming up. So thinking about Easter and thinking about the resurrection at this time of year seems particularly apt because resurrection, the idea of death into new life, is part of the fabric of creation. That's something that we see every year, and especially here, having cold weather for a while. I'm not originally from Wisconsin, so I'm still getting used to snow in mid-April, these terrible things that we live through. But seeing that even after that, there is still new life, that makes me think that spring is a good time to be considering this topic. So in terms of thinking just briefly about Scripture, since that's my area, the Gospel of John uses the metaphor of seeds, right? You may have heard the idea that when a seed falls, it dies, right? So in antiquity, people thought of seeds dying before they were sort of raised into new life. In that same gospel, Jesus uses metaphors of labor pains. So I heard that came up at a table, the idea that labor feels like a death or near-death experience, but new life comes. So it's interesting that there are some ways that resurrection might seem expected because it's part of our experiences. But in the Gospels, when we read the gospel stories of resurrection, I don't think we should read them as expected. They're actually scary stories. They're stories about people who go and expect to be able to see their friend. They expect to be able to anoint the body for burial. and they don't find the body there. So these empty tomb experiences, even though when we celebrate them at Easter, they feel joyful and we kind of know the happy ending, if we read them with fresh eyes, they're maybe not as expected or as every day as we might think, like the garden, right? The garden, we sort of know this is the time of year that there will be tulips, but that's not what the women knew when they went to the empty tomb. So originally, those stories might have actually been something much scarier, filled with grief, maybe filled with terror. So it's an interesting contrast to the ways that resurrection is a part of our daily lives, but resurrection stories in the Bible are actually something quite more unexpected.
So I have two starting thoughts. One is my own trying to figure out what actually happened. And I find that a lot of my thinking about prayer, resurrection, a lot of things is influenced by the very minimal understanding I have of contemporary science. But I have this kind of hunch that in things like quantum entanglement, that there may be an insight into how prayer works. Do not ask me if I understand quantum entanglement, all right? But I just have this kind of hunch there. Or about matter and energy and how we might come to some understanding of how the body of Jesus is experienced as body and yet not as body as we have it here. So that's kind of one place where my mind keeps working as I come in the Catholic belief that faith seeks understanding, so that there is a conversation between science and religion, not a debate. But I think the most important thing for us is, there's this line in the first Eucharistic prayer, which we don't usually hear too much anymore because it's such a different shape than the ones we're accustomed to. But there's this line, the faith that comes to us from the apostles. How does that get passed down? And I want to start with it in what is very, very important in Norbertine spirituality, what we call, I always use it in Latin, the Vita Apostolica, because the apostolic life in contemporary thinking tends to be, what kind of work do you do? But that's not what it is in the Acts of the Apostles. It's what kind of life are you living? And what has those who have been in Old St. Joe's Church on Sundays, they know I've been talking a lot about the fact that the Acts of the Apostles is on a hinge with the Gospel of Luke. It's got one writer through there. Luke did not know that somebody, a librarian, was going to put the Gospel of John between Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. Somebody, a neatnik, who was going to say, well, we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and well, Acts, but we have another gospel. We got to put that in here, So when you read them through, it's a interesting exercise to see what happens in the bridge. And the place that I think of especially is the rich young man, and the fact that in the Vita Apostolica they hold all things in common, and no one is in need. I say that the Vita Apostolica, this early Jerusalem community, is really God's plan for humanity, not just Christians. Catholics. It's God's plan for humanity, that faithful to the teaching of the apostles, to the breaking of the bread, to the common life, which is where that's in Greek koinonia, and in Latin it is communio, which is much more than holding doors open for people, all right? So it is this common life. So the bridge for me, that what makes that possible, to go from the man who walks away because he cannot dispossess himself for the poor, to a community that is not holding all things in common, making sure that no one is in need. So it's not a communism of everybody has the same amount, that no one is in need. That what makes that possible is their belief in the resurrection. And a place where that comes, where that has been recently founded in a certain sense, is in the Wall Street Journal. You'll always count on the Sunday I can't remember if it was in the weekend of Palm Sunday or Easter, George Weigel had the whole review article is on the resurrection, and he's going through all these things about how Constantine is taking Christianity because it's of a political reason. But he says that ultimately, what makes Christianity triumph is their belief that Christ is risen from the dead, and that belief grounds this kind of common life that attracted all the world.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. And Martha has done a tremendous job collating your questions, and terrific questions and a number of commonalities. So we're going to try to start with some of the questions maybe that recurred in the different table groups. A number of questions about why it is rising on the third day. Why 3 days? What was happening on days 1 or 2? Is there a significance of third or 3? Is there any connection to Jewish experience? So the creed tells us he rose again on the third day. Can you help us flesh out a little bit why 3 days?
That seems like a biblical question.
I guess I'm on. So the sort of basic answer is that this requires us to count differently. We count days as, like we think of now as sort of the beginning of the day. In Jewish tradition, you might already know, right, holidays begin at night, right? Days begin at night, which, I mean, as an aside, there's something sort of lovely there that the day starts at nighttime, and one of the first things that you do then is eat dinner, and then you rest. There's something sort of lovely about that conception of a day. So the first day is Friday, when Jesus dies. Second day is Saturday. Third day, Sunday. And I mean, why are there 3 days? I don't know. I wasn't there. But I guess my sort of theologizing about that would be there is then a real sense that Jesus has died, right? That's an important part of the belief in the resurrection, is that it's not Monty Python. Jesus wasn't sleeping. Jesus was dead, really dead. On Saturday, you have a whole day of Jesus not being alive. And so being raised on the third day gives a sort of span of time that there's no question that Jesus has really died. But I don't know if other people who are more theologians than I am want to theologize more on that.
The only thing I would add to that is I'm trying to remember there's a reading that we do on Holy Saturday morning, and so often in the Hebrew Scriptures you get this kind of he did this in 2 days. Yes, he did it on 3. That kind of, what do you call that? Yeah. All right. And yep. So that yep experience that I know that is in one of the Hebrew Scriptures. So again, their sense of living with that as perhaps seeing this third day as the fulfillment of that prophecy. But I think what Kathleen is saying probably is much more on target. Also, that the importance of getting to Sunday as the primal experience of resurrection. That we see that, for example, that in all of the that has come out from the Vatican on the situation where we are Sundays without Eucharist, without priests, that the critical thing, even if you don't have the Eucharist to distribute as Holy Communion, the primary thing is that the community assemble. That really is, that it is about assembly. It isn't that we come together to do Eucharist. We come together, that the experience of the risen Christ is in assembly. He is in the midst. We are not a evangelical television type of faith.
Great. Another question that came up a few times and is also kind of very focused on the wording that we experience in the creed. Why again? On the third day he rose again. Okay, Father Andrew, go ahead.
I said, I know that question is coming.
It did.
So I Googled. Because that's what I would tell my, is that one? Sorry.
That's okay.
I would, if my students asked me that and I didn't know, I would say, Google it. That's what I did while we're sitting here, all right? Because it's the sense of returning to life, right? It's a sense of, again, is coming back to life. It doesn't mean a second resurrection, all right? Google it.
Kathleen, any additional thoughts on that, or did Google take us home? No. Okay. And continuing to look at the language, rose again from the dead. Whether we're talking theologically, scripturally, or liturgically, what's the significance of rose again from the dead? What does that mean?
I'll jump in just with a quick history thing. So in antiquity, part of the belief of resurrection, it's interesting to note that in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, there are not references to resurrection, not really. That doesn't seem to be the belief that ancient Jews had, very ancient Jews had about what happened after death. It seems more like, especially like ancient Israel, had beliefs more like the Greek version of Hades, that you sort of died and everybody was dead and it was sort of a shadowy land. But then, maybe 200 years before Jesus, there start to be ancient texts that talk about resurrection, which is resurrection from the dead, which is usually this notion that there are people who die unjustly. They shouldn't have died. They shouldn't have been killed the way that they were killed, and therefore God resurrects them as a sign that they were killed unjustly and that the people who killed them were wrong to do it. So it's an interesting way of understanding Jesus' death in that context, that God says, no, that was unjust. That was an unjust death. So the first place that this idea of an unjust death being turned into resurrection comes from the book of 2nd Maccabees. So if you're a Protestant, that's not in your Bible. If you're a Catholic, it's like stuck right in the middle, kind of hard to find. The books of the Maccabees. It's where we get the story of Hanukkah from. And in 2nd Maccabees, there's a story of a woman with 7 sons who are unjustly put to death because the cruel ruler wants them to not be Jewish anymore, wants them to eat pork, and they refuse. And when that's happening, the mother encourages her sons to remain faithful to Judaism, even though it means death. And she says, and this is the first reference that we know of to resurrection, the resurrection of the dead, she says, not to submit to the cruel ruler, but to be faithful to God, because God will return her son to him. To her, will return him to her. So even a couple hundred years before Christ, there's this sort of early reference to the idea that it's unjust deaths, deaths that are not deserved, that get resurrected.
I was thinking with the question, what does this mean for us today? And if we were to apply that to our own life, to rise from the dead. And one of my favorite novelists is Walker Percy, and he has a novel called The Second Coming. And in that novel, one of the themes is the real death to fear is not the death that we all eventually face, the death that we die, but the real death to fear is sometimes the death that we live. So it's this notion that, in very subtle ways, we can slip into what Percy describes as a kind of death in life. We're not really living. It's not a truly human existence. So I understand that. I mean, we can take those same words as a kind of question for our own lives. What would it mean for us to truly rise from the dead today? What are the tombs of our own life that kind of hold us back, that shut us off from life? And what makes me think of that is if you look at the Gospels, it's not only Jesus that is really risen from the dead, but in a way, so were the disciples. If you think of the transformation in them between who they were at the time of Jesus' death, they were afraid. They were hiding. In some way, they also share in that resurrection. In some way, they're transformed by it. And you see that in Peter. I mean, he goes from denying that he ever knew Jesus, to boldly proclaiming Jesus, even at the cost of his life. So, to me, what makes, I guess, what it comes down to is that to see Easter not as just a feast that we celebrate one day a year, but see Easter as really calling us to a whole way of life. So what would it mean for you and I to live as Easter people? Not in some far distant future, but what would it mean for us today to live in the power of the resurrection?
Is that a quick follow-up question to this point? Because
I had a thought as you were talking about why the third day, and it never occurred to me before, but why 3 days? And I'm wondering if in the eternal wisdom of all things, that it's maybe not so much, you said that because Jesus was really dead, but that's a part of it, but it takes such an amount of time for somebody to face that reality and grieve it. The ones left behind are the ones who are grappling, and they're grieving in that process. So from their griefs and lamentations, that experience of resurrection becomes all the more powerful because they first went through all the grief. And it's like the cultures, they do have 3-day funerals because they go through that whole process.
Yeah, and
Give that one up, Andrew.
That's a very good point because, but I think it's where, if we're going to do numbers, and I'm bad at numbers, it's where 3 moves to 40, right? 40 is this number in the scriptures. I call it, it's the word, the word funnel comes from the word funis, which means that it's the birth canal, right? So you're in one state, and whatever number of 40 days, 40 years, 40 hours, you come out differently, all right? And so, like Rolheiser is very good on this, it's the ascension. Frankly, the ascension could have happened 36 days after, but it's 40 because it's this process of gradually letting go, and Jesus say he's prepping them. I need to go so that what is in some way still material among you is pure spirit. And now the body is here. This is the body. This is the body. So it's that the 40, I think, is really this process of grieving that is gradually letting go of one form of life into another.
Can I just add one quick
course,
thing?
of course.
So I was thinking while Paul was talking about this idea that there is resurrection elsewhere in the Gospels too. So Paul calls Jesus the first fruits of the resurrection and says, right, it indicates that Jesus was not the only one who was resurrected. And there's this little verse, I was just trying to look it up while Andrew was talking. There's this little verse in Matthew about when Jesus dies. At that moment, this is Matthew 27. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two, the earth shook. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep, which is a euphemism for dying, were raised. So even in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is not the only person who's resurrected. There's a sense that Jesus is the first among many, but not the only one. And so in terms of what it means, I like how you phrased it, that it's not only Jesus is raised and we celebrate Easter, but that we are supposed to live in that resurrection too.
Thank you. A couple of questions that I think connect. What is resurrection? How do we understand this as bodily or spiritual or something else? And then questions about what's our understanding about what resurrected Christ looked like? Did he look the same? Did he look different? If he had looked the same, would the effect have been the same? Old body, new body. So a lot of questions along the lines of how do we actually understand the resurrected Christ for the people in that moment? As well as for us today, it could be. Now they're drawing straws.
Looking at my watch here, I got to come. this is, I don't know, Julie, if this answers the question, but one of the things that always intrigued me is that when Jesus is risen, his wounds are still there. And I find a lot in teaching that I become really aware, I think, of the wounds that people carry in our lives, the hurts, the betrayals, the losses, the fears, the anxiety, whatever it is, and that becomes part of a person's story. And what's important to me is that when Jesus is risen from the dead, the resurrection does not erase the wounds. There's no indication, obviously, that Jesus still suffers from those wounds, but they're still there. And what's hopeful about it for me is that I think for us is how, in whatever ways that we can carry hardships in our life, that we can carry wounds, that we can carry losses, I think that to live in hope doesn't take those losses away. It doesn't erase them, but in a way allows us to integrate them into our story, to redeem the past in hope, because we can't know Christ apart from his wounds. We can't understand the resurrection apart from the crucifixion, apart from the passion. I think that's the same way for any human being. To know a person's whole story, we have to be able to acknowledge the wounds. The other thing I see Easter as every Christian's vocation in this sense, that if we live in the power of Jesus' resurrection, how are we called to help bring other people more fully to life? So it's not just in terms of how does Jesus' resurrection affect me? How is it a gift for me? But how am I called, just in the way I interact with people every day, to bring them more fully to life? So, sometimes the church says we're called to be an Easter people, and one way of understanding that is that we're called to be sacraments of Easter for one another, to be ministers of Easter to one another, and there's all kinds of ways that we can do that in our lives.
I was hoping that question wouldn't come, because it's something that I wrestle with. Not that I wrestle with it in the sense that I think I have a deeper and deeper faith in the resurrection all the time, but the way the question is coming of, Paul is leaving at just this point where things are getting really delicate.
Paul, hold on. It is the last week of the semester, and Paul is going to be with his students in class. So we do thank him for being with us and understand.
So it was. I was kind of hinting at that before, because I'm trying to understand how this is a body that is perceived as moving through doors, and yet is asking for food. Right. So this is where I'm going to get in trouble. I really don't believe that Jesus asked for food. All right. If he did, then my hope is that I can ask for pasta. After. Give me some pasta. All right, carbonara. Can I have some carbonara? So but I think that they are so intent in writing on to communicate that this is truly, something that is perceived by the senses, that this is the way it gets expressed. I'm a big fan of Teilhard de Chardin, and the way he would. Not just Tyra, because I find in the Office of Readings, the fathers of the church, when they're really saying much the same thing that Tyra is talking about, that the word of God is there, it's there for, eternally, and that this word is God's idea. It's the idea the artist has. So the artist has an idea for a painting or a sculpture or a piece of architecture. And the word becomes flesh in that work of art, so that that creation is the word is God's work of art is in creation, but at a particular moment, that word enters fully into human flesh in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, so that that divinity coming into humanity, when that humanity is raised up, it is becoming divine. And in the Eastern Church, that is called theosis. There's a process of divinization, so that Tired says this is kind of the final breakthrough. You know, we have the Big Bang, we have the formation of planets, we have the biosphere, we have life, we have the noosphere, the developments of our minds and consciousness, and now in the resurrection we are into what he calls Christogenesis, creation breaking through into a point of consciousness of all creation in Christ. This poor lady over here in the red scarf, she paid me a big compliment this morning. She said, "We're so sorry you're leaving." She said, "You tell us these wonderful things, but I don't understand what you're saying." Here I am again, all right? You know, she said, I have this sense that underneath there's something really important, you know? I think so too. I'm trying to figure out what it is, but but I think this thing of the Word becoming flesh. This is the critical moment of creation in history. The Word becoming flesh, because then when that flesh is raised up, and what is doing that is love. That is doing love. Then we are moving towards this, that God's, the internal word of the artist is heading toward its completion. Next question.
I didn't know if Kathleen, did you have anything else?
I'll add something more historical and far less profound, I think. So it helps me when thinking about this question of the body and like what is actually happening, what kind of body does Jesus have here, to remember that Jesus lives and dies in the first part of the first century, right? So he dies around 27 to 30 AD or CE. And then Paul is writing in the 50s and 60s, and the Gospels aren't written down until 70, 80, 90, maybe towards 100. So there's, most of that first century is spent wrestling with what happened. And Paul, writing closest to the actual events, but remember, Paul doesn't actually know Jesus. He has this mystical experience of him after the resurrection, but, wasn't a disciple in Jesus' own lifetime. Paul doesn't seem to know exactly what's going on. He talks about the difference between a spiritual body and a soulish body, and New Testament scholars have written more than you would care to know about the distinction between what those two things mean. And then it's not until the Gospels that we have those stories written down about what happens. And as Andrew and Paul both indicated, they seem to emphasize that Jesus is a real body, but not a real body like our real body. So, in that way, sort of the metaphor of seed works, right? That a seed becomes something very different, even though genetically they're still the same thing or whatever. But there is this sense that, like, even the writers in the New Testament don't know what really that body is like.
Yes, Father, because you're a Norbertine, you may.
It's okay.
No, you can.
I think to look at the story specifically, Mary Magdalene encounters Christ with a call. She calls out his name, and then she recognizes the bodily Christ. In the story of Emmaus and the breaking of the bread, the disciples encounter the risen Christ. And in the experience, the various stories, on the road to Emmaus, breaking open the Word. So they encountered the risen Christ in many ways the same way we do. We encounter the risen Christ when we experience a call. We encounter the risen Christ when we read the Scriptures. We encounter the risen Christ when we break bread together. So I think very much of what they said, just to follow up, if you look at the specific stories, there was a profound encounter with Christ. And so profound that it was not just spiritualizing what happened. They literally encountered Christ. I think everybody in this room has encountered Christ. So we have done it in one way. They had an even more profound experience in the first century.
Great, thank you. Yes, thank you. I'm going to throw out 4 words. These come from the groups, and I don't know if we just did shorthand in our compilation or if they were presented to us this way. So here you go, have at it. Hell, limbo, reincarnation, heaven. Right? Hell, limbo, reincarnation, heaven, all sorts of terms and themes that we might have in our minds as we're approaching this part of the creed.
Is our stipend going to be doubled?
Yeah, you bet, you bet. Twice of nothing. No, I'm just kidding. No, yeah. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
Well, I'm the
That's not a question. Talk about that. No.
I'm the hell expert, so hell. Well, whoever asked that question was not here in November. All right. So getting back to what was their cosmology, how they saw the world, right? So that hell was this kind of, I described it in November as Green Bay on a bad day. Gray, chilly. So it was this kind of underworld where people were just, they were there. And I think, and Kathleen, please correct me, that the sense of resurrection was of Israel as a corporate body eventually. It wasn't so much individuals, right? So that's the sense, in a certain way, of when, the November presentation, he descended into hell. He descends into the underworld, right? It's not the sense that we have of hell as a place of eternal punishment, right? So again, I'll get myself into a little trouble here. And I think, I don't know if I said this in November, my sense of what happens at death is, I used this in the homily last week. If you're lucky enough to go to Florence and you go to see the David, you're coming down the hall of the Accademia, and there are 4 huge statues, uncompleted, by Michelangelo. They're called the prisoners or the slaves. You can definitely see that these are big, chunky guys, coming out of the stone, but they're not complete. And I think that's a metaphor for our lives. It is a constantly ongoing work of art that is never complete, and it comes to God as incomplete. God simply wants to know, was this a work in progress, right? What is that encounter? And this comes from Karl Rahner. Karl Rahner's, this makes more sense to me than anything else about the moment of death, is the first completely free, unconditional decision we make. Because I'm not concerned about my health, my wife, my children, my, my portfolio, all right? And in this encounter, it is the encounter with absolute love, absolute love. So our life is a rehearsal for that encounter. Insofar as that rehearsal has been a work of love, I am completely open to that embrace. We call that heaven. But insofar as my life has, maybe been less than what it should be, it's painful, so that I don't see purgatory as fire. I see it as the moment, of someone that I deeply, deeply love, and I hurt them very seriously. And now we come face to face. This is a moment not just of embarrassment, it is of deep, deep pain. But the fact that we have come together face to face means that this relationship is not over. So I see purgatory not as a thing of time, but of intense, it is the quality of it, the pain of not being able to completely be embraced by that love, and the pain of moving through that. Now, of course, those of us who are raised as Catholics, we're thinking of that, well, I can get my grandmother out of that because I do 40 days. Well, God doesn't work in 40 days, all right? But we're using time to express coming out of that experience of deep pain. The third possibility, of course, is that a life has been so unloving that it cannot be embraced by that love, and we call that hell. We in the Roman Catholic Church say that there are some people that it is clear to us that they are in heaven. It's clear to us that most of us would probably presume that there will be some hesitation or pain in this experience of being embraced by love. We never say that we are absolutely certain that anyone is in that third situation. So and I think that even in talking about he descended into hell, we have to say, in some way, God is present even there. And I am not the first person, there are fathers of the church, much more thinking about this than I do, to say, maybe that is not eternal. Do not send this to the bishop.
We'll just put it on the web, Andrew, that's all.
That's all, right. Yeah, I mean, the only small thing that I would add to what Andrew said is from this list, hell, limbo, reincarnation, heaven, I think it's important that the ancient belief in resurrection is none of those things, but it's also not it's not resuscitation. And so that, I think students sometimes encounter the story of Lazarus being raised, and when we read that in class, students sometimes kind of say, like, oh, that's resurrection, isn't that the same thing? And it seems important to say that, like, no, that's a resuscitation, right? Lazarus is dead and then not dead, but the implication seems to be that he still dies after that, like a normal person does. And so resurrection is something different than just having an extra couple of years of life or something. And I think that idea of being fully embraced by love, seeing love as the thing that resurrects, means that if Jesus is the first fruits, then that's then open to all of us to be resurrected, to experience the love of resurrection.
Neither of us has talked about reincarnation. Yeah. Reincarnation. Google it. Yeah, it's not something I have to admit giving much serious thought to. Although I wish, of course I didn't know I would be here this morning, but just recently read something, but it was about how memory is carried forward. But yeah,
Oh, were you thinking of post-memory?
what is post-memory?
Maybe, I don't know. Post-memory is the idea that if you're, so they have, neuroscientists have charted this with the children of Holocaust survivors, that people can have memories from their parents' traumas. There's something genetic that changes in a person when they have experiences of real trauma, that then their children somehow have those memories in them. Is that where you were headed?
No, that was not where I was headed, but I was not headed anywhere, frankly.
Okay, I'm gonna bring you back.
Good.
This is maybe our last or maybe our second to last question, depending on time. The question states, why are there so many inconsistencies? And I don't know exactly what the table discussion was, but I guess as I read that, I wonder, we know, for instance, there are multiple birth narratives. And so maybe it's a question about, are there different portrayals around the resurrection in Scripture or in the early Christian community?
I think that's pretty clear. I would go back to what Father Michael was saying, to work from our own experience back into that. So I think one of the most beautiful stories is the story of Mary Magdalene. First of all, that whether it took place, in a garbage dump or not, it's the garden. It is Christ really is the gardener, because now God did not put us down in the jungle or the forest primeval, but he puts humanity in a garden. And if you are a gardener, that is a work of art. It's imagination, and then it's getting your hands dirty. And that's exactly what God is calling us to do, is to be the co-gardeners, bringing creation to completion. But what I love in that story is that how does she recognize Jesus? It's the way she hears him call her name. And I think that, we all have experiences in life where someone calls our name in such a way that it brings us to new life, right? I think, so that is one. The other would be, that we are fellow travelers. We're in some process together of I know that from students. Like most people, if you're in spiritual direction, you're meeting once a month. There's a number of students I meet with once a week because we're in this very short, period of time where we're trying to move something. And I say, there was a poster about the student farewell for me, and it said, he has impacted the lives of many students. And I make it very clear to the students, they impact my life by just, like the kind of questions that are raised here. If I find that in teaching, the best stuff comes out when somebody gives me the right question, something I haven't thought of, like reincarnation. but so I think you get different scenarios because, in fact, in our life, we all have different scenarios of how we are called beyond into a new level of life, whether someone calls our true name, whether we're journeying together, somebody invites us out to eat.
Or invites us to be on a panel. So this is a tricky question, thinking about inconsistencies was the word that was used in Scripture. So the way that I deal with it, you could deal with it, I guess, in one of two ways. Probably there are more options, but these would be the extremes, I suppose. So one way would be to try to line up the Gospels. In fact, I saw some of our MTS students here. We just wrestled through a book that's called The Gospel Parallels that puts the Gospels in parallel columns, and you sort of compare, wait, why is Luke missing this story, and why does Mark add these details? And that, I think, can really mess with some people's faith. It can be really hard to see that the Gospels are different. But there are, in terms of thinking about resurrection stories, there are a few consistencies, so we could start there. One is Mary Magdalene, right? We've heard her name a few times. This is actually the kind of earliest kernel of the story, is that the women go to the tomb, and when they get there, they expect a body and they don't find one. That's the sort of kernel of gospel faith, is that the body isn't there and the women went looking for him. So it's Mary Magdalene called apostle to the apostles, right? She's the one who goes to tell the other apostles, wait, he wasn't there. And also, right, I'm sure this is a footnote that many of you know, Mary Magdalene, not a prostitute, right? She's apostle to the apostles, not a prostitute. That's a later tradition that gets connected to her. So there are some things that are true across all of the Gospels. Jesus is really dead. There really is a crucifixion. Then the women go and expect to find him there, and there's an empty tomb. There are then a lot of differences, so that then if we were lining up those parallel columns might be harder to wrestle with. But I sometimes wonder if this is a problem that we have as modern people that ancient people didn't have, or didn't have in the same way. Because it seems to me that there was a lot of wisdom. There are 4 Gospels, right? Like there were councils that decided that there should be 4 Gospels. If they were all the same, then we wouldn't need 4 of them, right? We would just have one. And actually there was an early church father who tried to make them all into one, and it doesn't quite work to just like mash them into one text. So there must be some wisdom in having 4 and in seeing multiplicity there and not just making the 4 be exactly the same. So the way that I have heard it described, the way that appeals to me, I guess, in terms of wrestling with this multiplicity is thinking about portraits, right? If you have someone that you love, there's no one true portrait of them. There could be 4 that you love. Right? Because it's the person you love, right? If someone gave me 4 different pictures of my son, I wouldn't pick the best one and say like, that's the true one. No, there might be 4 different pictures, maybe at 4 different stages, maybe with 4 different facial expressions that show something about him, show something about his personality and the things I love about him. And so in that way, having 4 portraits of Jesus is maybe okay, even if they're not exactly the same.
Thank you. As a final question, I would just, this is the MC's prerogative, I'm going to bring in something, and we talked about this a little bit last night, those of us that were together. There's a Guatemalan poet, Julia Esquivel, who has a wonderful, nearly 3-page poem that in English is called "They Have Threatened Us with Resurrection." Right, and so she's talking about the experience of oppressed indigenous persons, and comes back as a refrain throughout the poem. They have threatened us with resurrection, and it talks in the end about you will know how marvelous it is to live threatened with resurrection. And I just wonder, as a final word, if you might reflect on what resurrection may mean for us as communities, and even just a thought of what it means. Are there peoples in the world, as she would suggest, that are threatened with resurrection, and how does that framing matter in their faith and in their lived experience?
I'll go first so you get the last word. How's that? Seems like the wise way to go. Yeah, I just read the poem and need some more time to sit with it and really meditate on it because it's lovely. Is it at all of the tables too?
No.
Oh, okay. Maybe we can pass it around. So I think the hope that I find in this idea of people being threatened with resurrection, what an evocative phrase. I mean, I think of the church in particular. So I was on a panel for Reformation Sunday, I think, back in October, talking about the Catholic and Protestant relationship 500 years after the Reformation. And someone asked a sort of doom and gloom question about young people not coming to church. And she was, I guess, asking me as the youngest person on the panel, what do you think about this, and how are we going to fix it? And the thing that occurred to me, and even though this, I think, is not this would not seem like a satisfying answer to church officials, perhaps, or to people who are really interested in numbers. But the answer that I gave was that, and Andrew and I were there together, so you've heard this answer before, was that if the church is about resurrection, then dying shouldn't bother us. And that's, of course, easier said than done, right? That I acknowledge that quite clearly. But if resurrection is what we're about, then death is what comes before that. And so there can be a way that we face deaths in our own lives, or the death of a community, or the death of a relationship, or the death of a dream, whatever the death is that we're facing. Not in a kind of Pollyanna, it's going to be fine, right? I mean, I hear students do that a lot when they're graduating, like, I don't have a job and it's really scary, but it's going to be great. Well, I mean, you don't maybe have to move to that smiley, it's going to be great, but there can be a deeper trust that even though we might face deaths in our lives, that there is still the threat of resurrection.
Yeah. The first thought, we did talk about the poem last night, but as you asked the question, Julie, it came to me in a different way, that in fact, Christian communities threaten their oppressors by their belief in resurrection. That it is only belief in resurrection that enables one to be a true martyr. I mean, whether that means shedding your blood or really standing for something. That it, in a way, that's getting to Weigel's point, that you have all, Weigel in this review, the big review article in the Wall Street Journal, talks about, that Christians, people saw their care for one another, et cetera, but that ultimately, you don't go to death for that. You go to death because of this belief in the power of love that will transform you. But also, I mean, I think I just want to. I wasn't thinking of what Kathleen said, but I just want to come in heavy in support of that. There's sisters here. We are, Norbertines. I think that we are, or the church, Christianity. I think that we are in a moment of real, truly beyond our imagination change. I think that, the future of religious life, for example, I think we are doing our best to keep that going, but, I think history is very, very important to study. The Abbey of Cluny had the largest church in Christendom. It had existed for 800 years, and it is not there anymore, right? In other words, there's this cycle of life and death, and that we see that continually new life arises in a different way, the seed. So I think it is our sense of hope, that hope, Archbishop Chaput from where I am in Philadelphia has a new book, and the first sentence is something like this: hope is a theological virtue. Optimism is something else, right? Hope is a belief in something beyond what you can imagine, that God has something in mind that none of us have thought of. Optimism is something else. So I have hope. I am not, frankly, very optimistic. And I have to say, I don't lose sleep over that, because I think I see this pattern from I see that pattern, not just, it begins already, it's throughout the scriptures, or it's in nature itself. When I have preached on the Transfiguration, that when this caterpillar becomes a cocoon, what is in it basically becomes soup. It becomes soup, and out of that becomes a butterfly. I think we may be in soup right now, all right? I think, and that is not a pessimistic thought for me.
Will you join me in thanking very warmly Kathleen and Andrew? Just a couple of very quick closing remarks. Once again, we send our thanks and our love and prayers to Dr. Dan Ritter for his gracious ongoing sponsorship of this series. And we do want you to know that outside, some of you saw it as you came in, there are some books available for purchase, including Dan's own book is available out there. We're grateful to all our colleagues in the Office of Communications, Print Services, and Conference and Events and Dining Services who always make us look good. And we let you know that at your tables, well, there's Father Senior's outline, but note a bibliography on the back, and so some titles he commends for our further consideration, and the comment card, as we already noted, and then a save the date for our fall offering with Dr. Peter Fan helping us continue our exploration of the Creed. So once again, thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again in fall. Thank you.